Welcome everybody. My name is Nancy Hossack and I'm a portfolio manager here at Foord. I'm really thrilled today to be chatting to Frans Cronje in our offices here in Cape Town. As many of my colleagues will know, I will do almost anything to avoid a camera, but today is a special exception to that. When I heard that Frans had agreed to come and chat to us, I was the first person to jump the queue because I was really excited to speak to him. And I know that many of you feel the same way because this is the record number of registrations that we've ever had for a webinar. So Frans, there's a huge amount of excitement about you being here. So thank you very, very much. For those of you who don't know who Frans is, and I know there won't be many of you who don't know who he is, Frans is an independent political analyst and advisor. He has over 20 years worth of experience and a really wide array of clients. I think something that really has resonated with us at Foord about Frans's approach is that it's very data-driven. So there are few people in South Africa that have, I think, as much insight into what South Africans are thinking and feeling, and that's because he has extensive research to polling data and also political research. And so something that really stands out is that he's somebody who looks at the data first and then makes up his mind. And that is really something that we try to do from an investment team perspective as well. It's really important, in our opinion, to get that order right. So just to set the scene a little bit, Frans is going to take us through some of that data initially. He's got a presentation for us. We're going to center a lot of that conversation around where he sees us going in 2024. And then I'm going to be lucky enough to ask him some of my more pressing questions. So with that, Frans, thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Nancy, thank you very much. And good morning to everyone who's watching or listening to this. What I'm going to do over the next 20 to 30 minutes or so is I'm going to take you through a series of charts. And the charts are going to show you data, chiefly about the politics of the country and a little bit about the economics and a little bit about public opinion. And step by step through those charts, I'm going to move to a point where I'm going to try and reach a conclusion. And to not hold you in any great suspense, my conclusion will be that I think the country is in a better position than many other observers appear to see. I think that we might be reaching a bottoming out point in our longer term political trajectory. And what I will argue very strongly for you is that at the very least, we now are assembling a series of trends in the political system and in the world of public opinion, that if we play those cards in an intelligent way, you can make a compelling argument that the country potentially is beginning to reach an upside horizon, and the next 10 to 20 years may see that begin to manifest. So how do we get to that? On your screens, you're looking at a chart, and on the left-hand side of that chart, there are percentages, and along the bottom of the chart run dates. And the first 6 dates, 94 to 2019, are the first 6 national elections that we had as a country. And then there's 2021 with an asterisk, because that's a local government election. It's not strictly comparable to a national one, but we can here sit and look at it and ask, does it show us something? And then through 2022 and into 2023, I show you a series of polls that are done of the national political position, many of which are done by a small group called the Social Research Foundation that I happen to chair the board of. What does it show us? Let's start with the ANC. They're in the sort of golden color, and they come to power in 94 with 63% of the vote. And a decade later, in 2004, a very important thing is happening, and that they're stronger than at that moment when Mr. Mandela leads them and the country broadly behind them, a great majority of people, to liberation. And the reason why ANC support rises in the first decade, and I'll show you some numbers on that later, is that the ANC in its first decade in power does a lot better at firstly restoring some economic stability and then raising living standards than it was ever given credit for. Subsequently, we now will begin to enter the era of state capture. The growth rate will begin to fall, and confidence and ANC support falls on the back of that. And in a slide about 1 or 2 from here, I'll show you the direct ties between living standards and the behavior of ANC voters. And that all culminates in 2019, when, with Mr. Ramaphosa at the head, the party dips at a national level below 60%. Subsequently, is this really important moment, 2021. It's a local government election. The ANC always does worse in those than in national ones, but they're now below 50%. And psychologically, that's very important. Because when I started out doing this stuff 20 years ago, if I'd said to a client or so, look, the ANC could lose power in South Africa, the idea was absurd. I mean, it wasn't a prospect. And people start to think, and you'll see that in polling data later in this talk, people start to think beyond the ANC. And if you're an ANC strategist, that's really the moment at which you are bringing on the inevitability of defeat. Polls through 2022 and into 2023 had the ANC just short of the 50% mark, so just clinging with its fingernails to a possible national majority. Early in 2023, we hit them at 52% and then at 51%. Later through the year, they were down into the low 40s, approaching 45, and they had a reasonable result into the end of the year. Advice from me, and I read a lot, I hear a lot about people saying they collapsed to 30%, not at this stage. And what I will tell you later is I think at a national level, the ANC is going to cobble together a government that will see them remain in power for 5 more years into 2029, and I'll also tell you that might not be a bad thing. There's the Democratic Alliance in blue, small beginnings, a bit of a setback into 2019, the growth track is interrupted, but subsequently under John Steenhuisen there is a recovery in that number, and we poll the DA in the mid-20s, sometimes touching a figure that approaches nearer to 30%. The very last one on that chart of yours, it gives the DA 18. That's done by a group that's not us. They do really good work, but I think on middle-class suburbanite sampling, they've got a problem. And I don't buy that 18% figure for the DA. Then we have the young freedom fighters who break out of the ANC between 2009 and 2014. Brilliant marketing. You can't not know that these chaps exist, and very clear messaging. But they struggle to break well north of that 10% level if you average the polls out. And the reason for that's a point I'll stress for you as we get deeper into this, is that public opinion in South Africa is very centrist and very moderate. And what sometimes a client will say to me, the EFF's terribly strong and the like. My answer often is that considering that we're a country where half of young people don't have a job, and these guys are brilliant marketers with a very clear populist message, they're not that strong at all, which is a comment on the amount of moderation that exists within South African public opinion, a point I will depend on heavily when I reach my conclusions for you later on. And there are the other parties, the smaller ones, now approaching the status of kingmakers, where they're your 2, 3, 4% party. Your influence in a future coalition government is going to be immense. And the bulk of those, the good news is, are chiefly centrist, moderate type parties. They don't sit on the far left fringe, they don't sit on the far right fringe. They sit in the center. Now, that's a lot of numbers. Let's simplify it enormously. Average the polls of the last 24 months, and where are we? The ANC is at 46%. The DA is approaching 25%. The EFF is just north of 10%. And all things being equal, and we'll test a lot of things ahead of this election, and the poll group I chair has in fact just gone into Natal to go and see what Mr. Zuma's doing. My advice to you at this point is that is the election result, or something very close to that you're going to see a few months from now. What happened that this occurred in the country's politics? Cause and effect. I find that where a group, an investor or ordinary people see this happening, they read alarmist things in the media, they become often very unsure. And that when you start to understand why it happened and cause and effect, that in and of itself introduces it doesn't mean the upsides are inevitable. You start to understand why politics shifts, you begin to anticipate what happens next, and it has, in a sense, a sort of calming effect. The data here runs from 1996, 97 out to 2024, and on the left-hand axis is a percentage, and on the right-hand axis are millions of people. And the first thing I show you is ANC support of the left-hand axis in national elections. That's what you saw earlier. They started at about 63, they peaked at 70, and at a national level, they fell back to 57 in 2019. As that was happening, this was happening to basic living standards in the country. Again, off the left-hand axis, the indicator I use for you is the share of families that go to bed every evening without electricity. And when the ANC came to power in 94, the date is 96, but it's the same thing. That was about 50% of families. And a decade later, an amazing and extraordinary thing has happened, because the figure is down to 20%. But through that whole era and into today, you will continue to read, including in the business press, that the ANC has presided over an era of service delivery failure, and that is just plainly wrong on the facts of it. Let me bring up another one before I make a bigger point on this. The number of social grants paid every month. You read that off the right-hand axis. It starts at about 2.5 million when we become a democracy, and by the time Mr. Mbeki is vacating his office, that figure has risen to about 15 million. And so whatever you think of welfare systems, it's a vast improvement in basic living standards of people. The fourth line I bring up for you, these little black ants that are marching across the screen, you read those off the left-hand axis, and that's the number of people with a job. And it starts at about 7.5 million in the sort of dawn of democracy, and when Mr. Mbeki is packing up his things in the union buildings, the number has doubled. But you will recall, if you're old enough to recall that era, that you were reading in the business press about the jobless growth that the ANC was presiding over, when in fact it had doubled the number of people in employment. And the upshot of all of this, and the conclusion, which is utterly unprofound, is that ANC support rose in the first era that it governed the country because living standards were improving so very quickly. And when those began to stagnate and later in some respects fall away, I mean, there's virtually no job growth for the past decade. The families with electricity, we're losing ground that we'd won, and the social grants, the rate of increase has slowed. That little sharp spike at the end is the COVID grant, this desperate effort. It's not enough, and ANC voters are motivated by one thing only, and that is the material circumstances that they live in, and that will remain the most dominant driver of voter behaviour for ANC supporters over the next 10 or 20 years. So you can draw a read from what that means for their support. Get an insight into how far the tide has shifted. I'm sometimes a client say to me that things are going so slowly, can we possibly make it? I think the country is changing at lightning speed, and here's an insight to that. Pretend that we break South Africa up into two pieces, and there's an urban South Africa and a rural South Africa, and they're going to have separate elections. If urban South Africa voted today, the ANC would get just over 30%. In rural South Africa, it gets closer to 70%, and that's why it's well understood. Rural South Africa, the demographic has living memory experience of apartheid, growing up black in the apartheid system in rural South Africa. The moment, you see this in all the social data, the moment that lived experience of the past fades in favour of present economic circumstances, ANC support falls away very quickly. The DA would now beat the ANC in urban South Africa, not in rural, for the reasons I mentioned. And even with the EFF in the bag, the ANC does not have an urban majority, and without a massive recovery in living standards, it cannot again even think of acquiring one. And irrevocably, therefore, what you see over here is what demographic trends, mortality rates in rural and immigration to urban areas trends are going to do to its rural voting bloc. The ANC, you can draw out of that, well, we've done the work on this, you can draw out of that the ANC is headed over the next decade to below the 40% mark, then into the 30s, and beyond that we'll explore as we carry on. Another way of understanding the country is to not just think about the national picture, but let's go into some of the provinces where the change that we will later experience at a national level is now playing out, and the blueprints of the coalition deals that will be struck will be tested in the year ahead of us. So we've got Gauteng and then the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And give you particular polls. The ANC in Gauteng, 40%. We've had them. These polling data, you must understand, isn't a solid thing. It moves literally from week to week, and we've had the ANC nearer 30% in some weeks in Gauteng. In the Western Cape, they're just over 10, and they've now been overtaken by the EFF. And in KwaZulu-Natal, last time out in a national election, they were in the mid-50s. Now they're in the 30s, and that was even before the launch of Mr. Zuma's new Nkonte Wesizwe party. The DA in this particular poll in Gauteng we had at nearer 30, but there have been days that the DA has beaten the ANC in Gauteng. In the Western Cape, it's strongly consolidating its position. There was a point when I wondered whether what we call coloured nationalist parties would begin to eat into the DA's Western Cape support. Polling shows that's not happening in the province, but there is ballot splitting in the province, where coloured voters back the DA solidly in the Western Cape, but are slightly open to what we call the Gayton McKenzie, a very capable chap and so on, to that kind of coloured nationalist party in the rest of the country. But the DA is rock solid in the Western Cape. And then KwaZulu-Natal. There's the EFF. The EFF and the ANC did not have a majority in Gauteng together. And when you start to calculate the national coalition deals that might have to be struck later this year, before you do that, start to understand the complexity of the provincial deals. If the ANC makes a national deal with the EFF, the opposition denies it access to Gauteng and KZN. And if the ANC is denied access to Gauteng and KZN, it will be on, which it's already on, an accelerated trajectory to the point where it becomes a regional party centered in the north of the country in the sort of dusty scrublands of Northwest and Mpumalanga and Limpopo. And there are ANC thinkers and strategists who understand this very, very well, that to be denied access to Gauteng, denied access to the Western, to KwaZulu-Natal, might set up the kind of collapse in support as the ANC relevance in those provinces fails that it has suffered in the Western Cape. And there's the IFP on the right, resurgent in KwaZulu-Natal. What do voters think of parties? I'll give you a bit of insight into voter thinking. So what happens here is we'd say to voters, listen, don't worry about who you like or don't like or vote for or don't vote for. We're going to do a word association exercise or phrase. I'm going to put a phrase to you, and you tell us which party you thought of. So those phrases, let's start with who's best at service delivery. And a third of voters say they thought of the ANC when they heard that phrase. A larger third said they thought of the DA, and just over 10% said they thought of the EFF. Now, if you're an ANC strategist, this is deeply troubling, because it means that the broader opposition, for which the DA is a proxy of sorts, has won a very important psychological battle in the minds of voters already. They think it's a better option, and the process of then moving towards voting for it becomes very much more likely. It just takes time. Which party breaks its promises? And the audiences, if you can see them, I cannot see you, always smile slightly at this point. There's the ANC, 75%. That's the brand. There is no way back to a strong national, let alone urban majority for a party that has attracted that reputation. There's the DA, not so much, and the EFF even less, which is quite correct, because those EFF chaps are very honest about what they intend to do if they're given the opportunity. And which party is violent? It's not so much the ANC, it's ever less the DA. That's the brand of the EFF. And you might, if you're very poor, destitute, frustrated, there might be a moment when you kind of buy into that populism. But in the cold calm of voting, polling station, EFF support is pinned to that level of just over 10% that I showed you earlier, because voters don't want to introduce the risk of violent anarchy into their communities. Then we get to Mr. Ramaphosa. He'll one day go. He must. And when he does, what does that do? And it unlocks a very new South Africa almost immediately. He polls much more popularly than his party does. So he's responsible for helping, artificially responsible for holding it at that 50% mark. So we've asked questions around this, and we've looked at the answers, and from those I can show you this chart. So Mr. Ramaphosa is no more. He's not an option inside the ANC. How do you vote in that election? The results are this. The ANC is at 35. The DA is approaching 30. The EFF is at 15, and the others sit over there. And I'm quite confident, I'm always careful, quite confident. You must have a lot of self-doubt when you do this kind of work, but I'm quite confident that by the end of this decade, what you're seeing there will broadly approximate the makeup of South Africa's parliament. And that doesn't mean anything's gone wrong. It's exactly what was always destined to happen. Because this is broadly what you'd see in the German Bundestag or in the Israeli Knesset. No major actor has more than 20 or 30% of the vote. And they negotiate deals to form governments. And if you've been exposed to some of those negotiations, Johannesburg, the most prominent case study, you might think, it doesn't fill you with hope, but you'd be wrong in a sense that you must think deeply about. That we are fortunate as South Africans to be in the minority of emerging markets, that when they get into deep economic and social trouble, that we are in at the moment, we have a clear avenue to change peacefully. And that when you see our politicians squabble with each other in cities like Johannesburg, as disappointing as it is, you must understand that the alternative, and the only immediate alternative, is violent change and revolution. And that we are spared, on great likelihood, is we're spared that result, is something that we should be very grateful for at this time. But that's where we will be as a country, politically, parliament, a decade from now. What do ANC supporters think of where it's all going? So you can ask them, and you don't ask vague, esoteric questions, or would you like to have more jobs or a better life? You ask hard, controversial questions to test where opinion sits. So some of those are here. And the way the question's put is, if a point is reached where the ANC needs to make concessions on policy, would you support the ANC in that, or would you oppose it? What do they say? Support is in blue. Hire on merit alone in the civil service. So scrap the entire basis of race-based affirmative action employment in the civil service. 65% of ANC supporters say they would support their party if it said that a point has come where this must be done. On the minimum wage, support for scrapping it is not fiddling with it, scrapping it. So clear, black-white decisions. Support is at 50%, and join a coalition, 75%. And what is going on in your mind as a supporter of South Africa's ruling party with its storied history, if you would now strongly support the idea of it getting into government with someone else? And opposing figures, there's also a group of people who say they're not sure, are very much less than support. And what's happening here is a common thing. It happens in political systems around the world, is that a party starts to kind of atrophy, and its supporters overtake it on the left or the right. And there's an idea in South Africa that Mr. Ramaphosa, the ANC, can't drive reforms because the people hold them back. That, I think, is completely wrong. I think the people are now well ahead of the party, and as a consequence, ANC support is slipping away. Then we get to you've answered the question in your own mind. Do you think coalition governments are working well? And the country agrees with you. Yes is 1/3 of people, and no is 2/3 of people. Jump ahead to the next one. Would you, however, despite your misgivings, would you agree that the opposition should come together to push the ANC below 50% and then form a new government? And the percentage agreeing, let's do it in terms of which party you support and all voters. Of all voters, 7 out of 10 say that would be a really good thing and make me very happy. 50% of ANC voters agree that this would be a good result. And when I stress for you the great importance of the centrist, moderate voting base, you have no better exposition of that than this figure within the ANC base itself. The DA voters obviously very keen on it, only outdoing the views of EFF voters by a very narrow margin. Then you ask the question, will this coalition you now hope for, but you're very disappointed at its present behaviour, but what you hope for, will it beat the ANC and form a new government? And at present the views are that it probably won't, and that reflects the balance of ANC opposition voting that we still continue to see. Then the question is, will such a government be better or worse than the ANC? And here I'm going to pause and say something. About half of people think it will be better and only a third think it will be worse, and the balance between those think that they don't know what it's going to be. Often I find someone who sort of come through my office and say the country's changing far too slowly, and they're astonished that we still put the ANC within reach of a national majority and that this would be catastrophic if it played out. And you can understand the sentiment, but my answer sometimes surprises people, that you should be very careful about whether you now wish to drive the ANC out of government, and after you've done so, try and grind it into the dust. And there are 2 reasons for that answer. The first is, do not depose a government without knowing exactly what is going to take its place. And at this time, that is uncertain. Yesterday, the multi-party coalition put out an economic policy document that literally could have been written by a primary school child. And you don't want to put in power a government that fails in its first year. And the reason for that is South Africans still today believe deeply in democracy, and that democracy and voting and a peaceful transition will deliver a better life. If that hope is betrayed because the MPC government, the multi-party coalition, fails to replicate the trends the ANC secured between 1994 and 2004, the disappointment in the populist will open the door to populist politicking, which is a very dangerous thing to happen. So I sometimes tell a client that it may be best to go through a longer term, slower transition. Perhaps we reach a point in 2029, which we will reach. I mean, we're going to be there, where the ANC is in the low 40s or high 30s, and then you do the democratic transition. If you ask voters what they want from a coalition, who do you want to get together, the answers are surprising to people at first glance. The plurality, the strongest figure, is the ANC and the DA coming together in coalition. Then the ANC and the EFF behind that, and everyone together in the third option, and the DA and the EFF gets 10%. Be cautious of analysis of coalitions in the mainstream. There's a very strong sense, sometimes amongst very wealthy donors and sometimes amongst journalists, that coalitions must be built between parties that have a lot in common with each other. That can work, but it often doesn't. Because parties in common with each other, that have things in common, like the multi-party coalition parties, are competing for the same voter, the same clients. They tend to fight with each other. Coalitions can work often very well between parties that have very little in common with each other, because they're not chasing the same voter. So the Greens and the FDP in coalition in the Bundestag is a good example of that, and in various earlier iterations of the Israeli government, the sort of blue and white in coalition with the Arab list would be an example of that. And I just wish to open the door here, we'll deal with it a bit later, to the prospect and my personal leaning that South Africa might be best served ultimately by the ANC and the DA coming together in coalition. And I think it could work very well. I want to move just one step from the politics to electricity in the time we've got, and show you a chart that was drawn up a year ago. And if you follow some of what I say closely, you'll know that over the last 18 months or so, I've been saying that we're not going to experience stage sort of 13 and a half load shedding. We're actually going to eliminate it. The reason for that you see in this data over here. It's a chart. On the left-hand axis are megawatts in thousands, up to 20,000. And then various kinds of sources of energy that the country relies on. So I'll bring those up for you. We were producing in the first quarter of last year, about, February 2023, about 16,000 megawatts of coal, and then there was a little bit of water and gas turbines. It's the diesel and the solar and wind and the reactors down the road from us here, and we imported a bit. Now, of the coal, our potential coal production was closer to 45,000, because 2/3 of the coal fleet is defunct. The strategy in the post-Andre de Ruyter era of the energy minister was to do something along these lines, to take that defunct coal fleet, almost 30,000 defunct megawatts, bring 10% of that back into operation. There's not much that could have been done on hydro. Buy more diesel to run the turbines. The Treasury and various parts of government had a year ago, and before that, been fighting about the diesel price. Solar and wind is being added automatically. The second reactor at Koeberg back online, and the effect of that would have been, which it happens to be, that production levels in that February week that this data was drawn from, it averaged about 23 or 24,000 megawatts, would rise to nearer 30,000 megawatts. And 1,000 megawatts is one stage of load shedding, and we were then flirting with stage 6 load shedding, which means that load shedding would significantly reduce. And it's a good example of, like the political analysis, of be cautious about particularly the alarmist stuff that you read in the mainstream media. It's often written by a teenager who's operating as an intern, chasing clicks in his news company. A much more staid and serious read can both show you downsides, but in South African data, more often than not, relative upsides. Where I conclude for you is with this chart over here, and say that given that the ANC is now just with its fingernails clinging to that last majority, after this election we head off in two broad directions, indicated by the left side of the chart and then the right side of the chart. First option on the left, I brought it up for you, is the ANC is going to win outright this next election or cobble together a majority with some of the fractional tiny parties. So it gets 48 and it brings 2 or 3 little ones in. Alternatively, on the right of your screen, I'm wrong on the ANC call, and the ANC loses by so far that the fractional parties can't restore it to power. It needs to make a deal with either the EFF or the DA. So we're going to set off in one of these two trajectories. What happens from there? Let's start on the right. The first option in this, I'd say that the left and right of your chart, you can literally give 50% odds on, because that's where the political data is. Inside the right-hand option, 50% odds becomes that the ANC is then going to make the EFF deal. As a consequence, there's a deep shock, sharp economic contraction. The indicators run quite quickly and dramatically. We enter a deeper 5-year economic slump, the consequence of which is that this becomes the catalyst, the vector, around which we bring a strongly centrist coalition government to power. And the reason to say that, what I showed you about 2-3 slides in, the relationship between material circumstances of ANC voters, voter behavior in the country, is that the faster circumstances fall, the faster you're driving voters into the centrist coalition. Second option, I'll give 25% odds on the side of the chart, is that the ANC makes a deal with the EFF. We confront a steep economic contraction, and then we see that alliance drive through the constitutional edifice and the rule of law, and we do not get to another free election, and we gravitate into failed state status. And the third option is the ANC makes a deal with the centrist opposition, with the DA, and we get into the prospect of a messy and slow economic recovery. On the other side, with the ANC's nearer 50, it's got its back in national power, It could drive a reform process, and I've given it a very strong sort of 25% prospect of doing that. I don't think it's going to get there, though. More likely is that it fails to drive reforms, sees a steep loss of support. It then is terrified at the implications. It drives into that populist coalition, likely then with the EFF. We see the steep economic slump and the populist politicking, and we get into very deep trouble. But the likelihood, the plurality for me on that side, was that it ultimately fails with its smaller partners to drive reforms. Steep loss of support in 2029 brings a centrist coalition takeover and the prospect of economic recovery into being in 2029. So in this sort of analysis, my last point, and I go back to Nancy, in this sort of analysis, strip your hopes and fears out of it. There's no place in this kind of thinking. Think through the data and the trend lines and have a good understanding of history. And if you do that, the cold clinical analysis now is that on the balance of probabilities, the upside odds of a centrist coalition government doing its best to bring about an economic reformation is where we are headed as a country. And Nancy, back to you.
Thank you so much, Frans. And thank you very much for those, I think, just very clear scenarios and probabilities that you've put to it. I mean, my first question is, if I just take a step back and we go with a scenario in which the ANC needs a coalition partner in order to get a majority. Just put me in the shoes of the members of the ANC that are brokering that coalition and give us an understanding of what their priorities are going to be in terms of extracting the best coalition for the ANC. So what does success look like for them? I mean, are they looking for, positions in government? Is it legislative support? Is it access to resources?
Yeah. Look, the horrible thing that happened inside the ANC is that its internal ranks have been deeply corrupted to a point where the short-term ambitions and fears, often of going to prison, of senior ANC leaders override the good sense that's needed to save the party. And in some work done many years ago, already, it was suggested that a point had been reached where a majority of the executive committee members of the ANC, which is essentially the board, could be implicated in corruption to a point that they might be sent to prison. And because there's such a group within that party, and because the more centrist leadership of the party doesn't have the courage to hound it out and send it to prison, ultimately, through the courts, the ANC is stuck in this quagmire where there's a perfect understanding, I assure you, of the risk of a loss of defeat and a quite clear understanding of the reasons for that material circumstances of people drive things. You do not need in ANC circles to explain the problem. It is better understood there than often outside of the party. But because there is a fear of what the consequences would be if the country became a fundamentally free and open place, many of these individuals might then be pursued and prosecuted. The prospect of the ANC breaking towards reform is very limited. And it's partly for that reason that I think the prospect of the DA-ANC coalition is one worth entertaining. Because for the ANC's, whatever remains of its leadership, to break towards that deal, implicit in that, would be that the less desirable elements of the party have been surrendered and have been left behind. But why it was always futile, there was a lot of confidence around Mr. Ramaphosa and the group and the team I worked with at the time had grave doubts about that, was because we understood that one of his priorities would be to unite the ANC. And that was a strategic miscalculation, because in uniting it, they would cut off any avenues to the reforms necessary to restore the confidence of the supporters necessary to secure the majority. The consequences of that are what we see in the data today.
So in other words, you needed to have actually a purge of the party in order to have any reform of some of its members.
The only way that it might have saved itself would have been to have a very brutal internal conflict, which would have left the, let's call it the reform element of the ANC, likely with a political, without a majority. And its only likely then avenue back to power would be a deal with the centrist DA. And I think the prospect of that was so difficult and daunting that the strategy that was in fact pursued was, let's see if we can unite this. But what you were uniting is you were uniting a decent people and reform-minded thinkers with dangerous and powerful crooks. And the net result of that is this kind of atrophication and stagnation, which describes, the feelings of a lot of people, observers, and in fact the policy behavior of the ANC over the past 5 or 6 years.
I mean, just further to that, I saw in your kind of probabilities that you actually put, if the ANC does need a partner to get them to a majority, that if you add up those probabilities, you put 75% probability on them doing a deal with the EFF rather than the DA. And I mean, to your point, is that really the reason? And is it because the DA will be a lot more demanding in terms of what they would demand from a coalition arrangement?
Look, what the motivation for the EFF deal would be is maybe we can strike something that protects powerful individuals from the future prospects of prosecution, which is a very frightening prospect if you put yourself in the position of that person. You're now putting in place a chain of events that might end up with you going to jail because you've done whatever you've done. There's a second view inside the ANC, which is the more sophisticated view. And that says, if we do this EFF deal, we're going to take our brand, which I showed you, which is dishonesty and betrayal, and we're going to mesh it with the EFF brand, which is violence and anarchy. And we're going to do that in a centrist country where our last kind of redoubt of support is an aging rural demographic that will be eroded at the mortality rate. And what we're going to simply do as a consequence is accelerate what you saw in the urban voting data, this flood of voter opinion away from the ANC into the centrist opposition. And I think that's correct. And where that ends is with the ANC becoming then a regionally based rural party in northwest Mpumalanga and Limpopo, where it will fight it out to the death, sometimes literally, with elements of the EFF, while more urban South Africa and the East Coast and so on picks itself up, and down here in the Cape picks itself up and begins the reform process. So for more centrist ANC thinkers, and there's some heroic people left inside the ANC under terrible circumstances, desperately disappointed and trying their best. For them, and I think they're right on the strategy, is that the EFF deal is a dead end for us. The only way we don't lose power if we make the EFF deal is by destroying the democratic infrastructure of the country so that we don't have to face another election. Because if we do, we will surely lose, and they're right. Now, a client might take me to the point of saying, well, if they make the deal, they're definitely going to destroy the democracy. It's all over, and we should just sort of flee to the wilds of Canada and the Australian outback. It's not that easy to do. To become a fascist, autocratic dictatorship, you firstly need a very efficient civil service and strongly motivated, ideologically motivated, radicalized security infrastructure. We don't have either of those. So your occasional frustrations at the incompetent civil service has a flip side that it saves you from the risk of that. Secondly, any attempt to actually get us to a point where we really won't have another election means you first got to print a lot of money to create inflation and populism and harness that to your autocratic scheme. You then need to stamp out the independent media so that the articulation of ideas in society can no longer occur. You then actually need to cheat in that election to a point that completely overrides the ability to expose it and see it. It is very difficult to do, even if you had that civil service. So my sense is that an attempt, let's say you do put the ANC and the EFF together and they do attempt to do this, the likelihood is that they will fail. And that in their failure, we'll go through a rough few years, but in their failure, what they will in fact begin to do is to bring a much stronger centrist coalition government to power. Now this stuff is very difficult to think through because we're exposed to a lot of mainstream stuff and we live in the country, many of us, we're invested in the country and it's hard to get away from the fear and the hope and so on. But on the cold, clinical, thinking it through step by step, balance of probabilities is the attempts to destroy the society, if we're now at that point, will in fact deliver an accelerated reform government. And that's just that's just where the data and the lessons of history and the hard facts are taking us. And I'm accused sometimes of being optimistic, and which is different territory to the first 10 years of my career, where I spent a lot of time warning that we could get into trouble, using the very same methodology that you see here this morning. But I think that if you get out of the noise and you think through it, at the very least, you will have to entertain the prospect that a reform horizon of what remains a still free society, attempting an economic recovery, is a prospect now that must be taken very seriously. I think that's perhaps the most qualified way to put it.
Right. I just wanted to touch on one other consideration, which is something that you referred to earlier, which is unity within the ANC. And a lot of the press around this subject has died down post the previous elective conference because, you know, the Ramaphosa faction sort of seemed to get a lot more support in the NEC than they had in the 2018 election when he was originally elected with a very small majority. What are the ramifications for the ANC internally of entering into an EFF coalition?
Yeah, the internal ramifications are deeply destructive because you would drive out the last of the reform-minded individuals because they wouldn't be able to. They're good and decent people that have stuck it out. You drive them out and you'd set yourself off on this destructive trajectory where you would almost immediately, given the shocks to sentiment in the country, which translates into investment and growth and almost directly into living standards and job creation, the polls, I'm very confident, would immediately show that the declining ANC support is now going into a dive. And as the prospects of defeat and what's necessary to evade it become more apparent, the likely development inside the ANC is that the last turn inwards on each other and the institution falls away. And a way perhaps to think about it is a story I used to start a lot of briefings with is if anyone is old enough to remember that in August of 1985, if you weren't around, it's the end of the apartheid era, the country is in chaos and conflict. Growth is nowhere. The American banking group Chase Manhattan won't extend the loans, it's bankrupt. White conscripts are fighting black kids in townships, and there are wars on the frontline states. Quite the horrors of Gaza, but not far off. And if you'd at that moment said, you know, I think what's actually going to happen here is that within a decade, the last leader of the National Party will be the tourism minister in an ANC government that will take the country to its first budget surplus since the formation of the Union, and economic growth rates back to 5%, which for 4 consecutive years that hadn't happened since the first half of the 1960s. People would have thought that's very difficult to go along with. Now, in this kind of work, there are a lot of examples of that nature. If you'd stood in the mall in Washington when Mr. Obama made his speech and said, yes, we can, and turned to your friend and said, it's really interesting what's happened, but I think Donald Trump will probably be the next man to stand there, that also thought it's very difficult to happen. And when he departed, there were a lot of Democrats who thought they probably wouldn't see him again, and the Republican primaries are suggesting we might be revisited by Mr. Trump. The importance of all those stories, and apply to South Africa too, is do not be bold sometimes in your thinking of what the little nascent trends, if they continue uninterrupted, lead you to as a future society. And in our case, again, to say it for the fifth time, but it's very important, is our political system is actually working to give us the prospect of peaceful change, unlike the majority of emerging markets before us that had to fight with rifles in the streets. Public opinion is immensely moderate and centrist. I mean, half of ANC voters hope that the opposition will get together to depose the ANC. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that you get to this point. If you take just, and the immense potential of the country beyond that, if it's not abused and looted, what simply happens, and therefore it's not off in this moment to. And I'd advise you hedge yourself on South Africa. This is not assured. Do not go home and be complacent and think, well, it's all going to be wonderful. But we've been dealt a hand now that gives me the sense that the longer term outlook for the country is perhaps better than it's been at any point in the past 10 years.
Frans, can you give us a sense, when you're looking at projections for 2024, you see a lot of different results based on different turnout assumptions. And we were chatting a little bit about it earlier in terms of this quite big discrepancy you see in the ANC support base. This is a support base that often votes in national elections, but doesn't vote in local government elections, although that discrepancy has been reducing over time. Give us a sense of where you think turnout will be, and whether those additional ANC voters that they've relied on in national elections are likely to come out.
Yeah. Now, turnout's what share of voters actually arrive, and in most of the numbers I showed you, we have assumed a turnout scenario, which is in the high 60s, which is in line with what it was in the election of 2019. And the reason for that assumption is we test questions of how aware are you, how nervous are you, so you can get a sense of it. If we're well off on turnout, even if we're well off, you might see the ANC a couple of points below where I've put it to you. You might even see it get a 53 or a 54, 55, maybe get to 56. I don't think that matters a lot, because the bigger story that I'm trying to tell is that we are in a band now of such deeply entrenched trends, economic, socioeconomic and political, and how they relate to each other, that the ANC cannot pull us out of that band and evade the necessary end game. And the necessary end game now, whether I'm surprised and it happens faster than I'd anticipated. Maybe we knock them down to 40 this time. Maybe it's 2029, and maybe, I think very unlikely, they cling on into the 2030s, but I think very unlikely. It doesn't change the broader conclusion that we are, as a country, approaching a point where we will be given a serious shot at restoring a democratic and prosperous society, and and it could be very different. If you do this work in other parts of the world, had we had a radicalized population here, driven with hate and populism and strange economic ideas, I'd be telling you this couldn't occur at all. If we had a highly efficient sort of security order in the civil service, if we were the two of us sitting in Hampstead, and the conversation was, how do we get John Steenhuisen out of jail? because that's where he's been put, or any of the opposition leader. Then I would say to you, the upside is very difficult to attain for us. And the slightly odd thing sometimes about hearing the South African conversation today is when you understand that sort of relative, the alternative. South Africans might think, and the country's in desperate trouble, and I completely appreciate that. But there's a sense of thinking that the worst things that could ever happen to one have happened to us now. And we are the damned of the earth, and run for the airport, 2 of us after this, run and see if we can get the last flight to wherever. And in fact, that's wrong. That's wrong, and it's dangerous, because the trends as they are assembling for us are the moderate populace, the political system that's working. The leader of the opposition, probably somewhere here today, delivering a speech about why you should remove the ruling administration from power, and secret police aren't going to drag him away in the night. And yeah.
Although what I'm hearing from you is that it might be quite a rocky path to get there. So
of course it's rocky. For 400 years here it's been a rocky path. You know, we tend to benchmark South Africa's success on the window from really 1996 to 2007, when we had a government in power that was presiding over an economic recovery and growth. But for all of us involved in this, or who have a direct stake in it, you could argue we've all, to a lesser or greater extent, been here for several hundred years. Or the modern South Africa's been here for thousands. But let's take it back 400 years. In those 400 years, it is only that window from 96 to 2007 where the country was well governed to the advantage of all its people. For the preceding decades, or centuries, eras, the country was generally badly governed. Conflict, terrible conflict, and violence and abuse and oppression and very poor economic performance. I mean, I sometimes you kind of see like youngsters in the audience. You remind people that coming out of into the democratic dispensation became off an era of interest rates of 20%, and they gasp as to how did you buy a house? Yeah, it's impossible to have interest rates of 20%. That's where we were at, and. It's not, again, certainly not to say everything in the present is fine, but we are a normal emerging market with serious emerging market problems. And that is what the right way to think about the country is. It was always inevitably going to likely be the case here. But with the advantages that we're a free society with a moderate populace on a track potentially to a much more successful future. And I think therefore the present angst about the state of things is not misplaced. It's not wrong. It's not be joyous and it's not that at all. It's just that the position requires much more sophisticated thinking about than is often the case in the media or in the sort of loose talk around dinner party or something of that nature. Let's
talk a little bit about the DA, because we've spoken a lot about the ANC. How do you think the leadership of the DA evolves over the next 5 years?
I think it remains pretty much what it is, but you must think of the DA, you can think of it in various guises, and a common way to think about the DA is that it must change itself to become attractive to traditional ANC voters so that it can get the 55% majority and govern the country without the need for a partner. Now this is all wrong, I think. It cannot happen like that, and nor should it, and I don't think the DA should even attempt to do anything of that nature. We come from a history of 400 years where very big, powerful actors determined how people within the country behaved, because at no point in that period were people free to choose their leaders. As soon as that starts to happen, which is when apartheid lived experience fades into the present reality, which is where we're at the moment, you saw it in the urban vote. As soon as that happens, what occurs is the politics begins to reflect the cultures of our society. And cultures aren't language groups and so on. And the DAs or ethnic groups or racial groups, they're not really those aren't the most important drivers. They're important, but they're not definitive. The DA at 25%, approaching 30%, has captured the urban, younger, aspirant, emerging and established middle-class voting market, completely cosmopolitan. And its function, I think, should remain to grow its share of that vote. But the share of that vote is going to max out at 30 or 35%. The ANC instead is, or what comes after it, of what it gives sort of life to after it's gone, is going to be about the third of the vote. That's the more fringe of that cosmopolitan urban world, more Africanist, slightly older, and very much poorer. And that makes complete sense for the ANC, and that's the market I think it should bring into the coalition deal with the DA. And beyond those two parties who've got their DA's a third of the vote or so, and the ANC a third or quarter or vice versa, doesn't really matter. We'll have a third party, which will be the hard left fringe, which will have 10 or 15%. And you can see the chart I showed in the course of this, what happens after Mr. Ramaphosa. The chart is appearing in your mind again. So the DA's got about a third, and this ANC sort of Africanist group, or whatever it will be, will have a third. So 2/3 is 60%, let's say, and the radical left, it says, as 10 or 15, so let's go to 75. That leaves 25. The 25 will be small little splinter parties that represent narrow ethnic, nationalist, language groups, special interest groups, a few crazies, a few kind of religious right-inspired parties, whatever Zuma's up to in KZN. He could, if he does extremely well, get a few percentage points. I don't think much more than that. And what this description of the politics is actually an overlay of the broad cultures that form South African society in an environment where the members of those cultures are free to choose who they want to represent them. It can be a mistake to try and merge those cultures in one party or institution, because they can have competing interests, and those parties can then fight, and then they get paralyzed and they begin to atrophy. So the ANC is trying to merge the cultures of the honorable movement of the past with the looting and stealing of what happened to elements of that party. So it's completely paralyzed. However, taking different political cultures in their separate parties and taking them to a coalition negotiation works very well, where they are able to find common ground on questions like safety, or the creation of jobs, or good schools for kids. So I think it's a view widely held, particularly amongst the well-heeled, that what must happen is the DA must replace the ANC and sort of govern the country with a major majority. First, it cannot happen. It's very difficult to do, much more difficult. And it's not necessary. And lastly, and most importantly, it could be very destructive. So I think the DA is doing exactly what it needs to do, in the way it needs to do it. And I think it's done well in getting to where it is. And it needs to be understood that it has now captured a third of the voting market, a block that will grow in time to whatever extent the economic growth rate allows it to. And it should consider, and I'm also careful of dictating to politicians, because there's some really good guys around who work very hard and have their own ideas, and they don't need analysts always to tell them what to do. But I think the DA should be regarded as very successful, and it will bring its market share to a future coalition negotiation.
I think maybe one of those politicians that works very hard has certainly been Jordan Hill-Lewis, who's our mayor in Cape Town. And if you speak to Jordan, he speaks a lot about this concept of divergence, which is that he wants Cape Town, in all its key metrics, in its lived experiences, to diverge from the rest of the country. So how do you see the Western Cape evolving in terms of its importance in South Africa? And obviously I'm going Cape Town, Western Cape, and also globally.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the Western Cape is one of the world's most exciting emerging markets. There is a crowd around here, and I think they're motivated by the right things, and the good guys who talk about the sort of secession of the Cape. And sometimes when people think about that, they think about a sort of formal secession. There'll be a line drawn on a map, and that side will be the sort of wilds, and this side will be the Cape. I think it's a very dated way to think about divergence. Certainly to think about secession. It's not that at all. Simply, given tech, the ability of people to work and move around freely, the Western Cape automatically starts to develop competitive advantages over the rest of the country. If the rest of the country fails very quickly, one consequence will be the dumping of more skills and more capital and more Western global geostrategic interest into the Cape. If the rest of the country recovers and becomes a great success, that will buoy the Cape's own competitiveness and success. So it's very difficult to reach a position if you're based in, you might think I'm surprisingly upbeat on South Africa's prospects, but I'm firmly upbeat on the Western Cape's prospects because they have now diverged to a great extent from that of the rest of the country. And something that's not covered in our press at all, and it's emerging, and you'll certainly see it as a theme over the next 5 to 10 years, is Western democracies are developing, are thinking about the Cape in a new way. They realize, Americans realize, for example, that they probably cannot take on the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea because the Chinese missile batteries on land would wipe out the Americans. So if they want to confront China, they've got to confront it easily, apparently, in just the open ocean. You need to find a global choke point, something like the Malacca Strait, or Hormuz, controlled by the Iranians, or Bab al-Mandab, which is a complete chaos now with the Houthis sort of flying drones all over the place. One of the most important choke points becomes the passage off southern Africa, where shipping traffic, if something goes wrong in Suez or Panama, needs to move between the 50th and 60th parallels. If that passage is allowed to fall to Russian or Chinese influence, so South Africa collapses, we become a Russian proxy state. That would make it possible for China, for example, would then also be under great Chinese influence, to start to move up Africa's west coast. And a Chinese submarine parked in a pen off the coast of Equatorial Guinea, all of which is in process, places the Chinese submarine closer to New York than if the Chinese had a base in Hawaii. And a little bit late in the game, Western national security thinkers are waking up to realize that the geostrategic real estate around Africa's southern tip and our coastline is some of the most valuable geostrategic real estate in the world, and we cannot allow it to fall, regardless of what happens in the north of the country. And that will greatly buoy, I think, the prospects for the Western Cape. So, and the election trends for the Western Cape, as I showed you earlier, are also a consolidation of DA support. So, and you do have an absolutely amazing mayor in the city and what he's done. I mean, I do know the chap a bit, but I can also tell you flying in, it's unavoidable. Yeah. So, if you're a Western Cape based, whatever you are, your never be complacent. Don't go home and think it's all fine. That's certainly not what I wish to convey. But I wish to convey that the trajectory for the Western Cape is particularly strong.
it's fantastic to end off on a positive note.
Yes.
Frans, I could chat to you the whole day, but I'm getting rude messages in my ear, so I think that we have to wrap up. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who has dialed into the webinar. I know that there is a survey at the end of the webinar. As you log off, if you could just fill out that survey, we'd be really thrilled. And we will also be doing CPD points for this webinar, so all of those accreditation will be sent out to you as well. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Frans. Goodbye, everybody.